At dozens of locations around the country, faith leaders and activists have been reactivating the Poor People's Campaign, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of a similar campaign for economic justice led by Martin Luther King Jr. The new initiative is a push for change on multiple fronts, from racism and poverty to the war economy and threats to the environment. Among those participating locally is one of the campaign's three chairs from Massachusetts, Savina Martin. Thank you very much for being with us, Savina.
Oh, you're welcome.
You were growing up in Boston back in 1968. How does this moment of this campaign sort of pick up from what happened 50 years ago?
It has just been amazing. I have always been intrigued and passionate about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King ever since I was little, and knew that something was happening. So today, just to be a part of this movement building, and the legacy of Dr. King has just been kind of cathartic for me. And so I'm one of the dedicated organizers. I don't know anything else to do and would not want to do anything else at this time. That is so important around issues of poverty and building relationships with diverse cultures and people, just like Dr. King dreamed of.
So what got you started on the campaign itself?
Well, for one thing, during the assassination of Dr. King, my mother, well, I was young, I didn't understand what was happening outside of our home. I noticed my mother outside having a conversation with the police. Little did I realize that Dr. King had been assassinated. My mother went outside to look for my brothers. I was looking out the window, saw the police. They bent down, looked like they were picking up stones. I was frightened, I screamed. My mom turned around, everything was slow motion. She came back in the house. And I think at that moment, the spark in me for the passion of doing this work was lit. And that's essentially what happened, right? The witnessing and the trauma. As I always talk about this story of a young child like myself looking out of the window and seeing something so devastating happening, and then, you know, the texture, it was just all so real, and as to this day, and smelling the smoke, and then, you know, researching later on and finding out that 15 blocks of your community was burned, and, you know, people were getting beaten and hosed down for what they believe in, just like today. So I am so happy that this legacy of Kings has been sparked and reignited and literally in motion all over the country.
One thing that hasn't changed in 50 years, we still have these competing narratives about poverty. On the one hand, you know, you solve it with collective action, government intervention, and on the other side they say, no, it's all about free markets. Just let them do what they want and fewer people will be poor. What do you see here?
Well, as we see, 50 years after the delay in the assassination and the disruption of King's vision, 50 years later, we see the conditions in this country that have even worsened. One of our principles is based on shifting the moral narrative that we should turn away from and take action against how we have blamed the poor for poverty. And as Reverend William Barber II and Liz Theo Harris so eloquently and brilliantly have phrased, that we need to shift this moral narrative of the distorted moral narrative that has, again, blamed us for our poverty. And that's why we're organizing tens of thousands of men and women who are the least of these, the poor and dispossessed, to take power, to have this platform, to speak their voice, to understand their truth, and what is their fight and plight around poverty issues in this country.
This has been on news, and we're talking with Savina Martin from the Poor People's Campaign in Massachusetts. Savina, we're coming up toward the Memorial Day holiday, and you're very concerned about issues affecting veterans because you are a veteran.
Yes.
So what's going to be happening around here?
Well, as you know, we are headed into what is now the second week of nonviolent moral fusion direct action. And that means the fusion of mobilizing many different organizations who share the same concerns that we do around poverty, systemic racism, the war economy, and as King said it, militarism, but it's the war economy, and we have added ecological devastation. Well, this Monday coming is the war economy theme, along with the proliferation of gun violence. And that war economy, because I am a veteran and many other people are veterans who have either gone into combat or non-combat, had found for many, many reasons, coming back from deployment and being in certain situations in this country. If you are low income, you still have to earn a livable wage. Even though you may have other supplemental incomes, you still cannot afford, right, to provide for your family, you know, if you're part of that 99%. So with that, we will be talking about the stats on the war economy and the military-industrial complex. Like, for instance, 53 cents of every federal discretionary dollar goes into the war chest. We plan on having a 24-hour vigil on the Commons, many, many speakers. It will begin May 28th and will go into May 29th, which will be our national action around this country on the war economy. So we plan on having a multiplicity of organizations like Veterans for Peace. We have nurses, we have doctors. We're going to actually erect a bivouac that we would, you know, it was part of a military activity to spend the night or spend some time in a certain place and talk about how the war and the war at home affects us.
Veterans are also affected by the services they can get from the Veterans Administration. There have been a lot of problems with those as it is now, and now there's talk about privatizing at least some of those services. What do you think about that?
Look, the VA hospitals, of course, we know we've been advocating for many, many different improvements, in particular improvements for women's services, women veteran services. The Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and other lawmakers that have been advocating for these services to be improved need to be held accountable, right? We need to be held accountable. We say no to privatization. It's a space that we all understand as being veterans. There's a certain language, and there's a certain type of care and compassion in the midst of all of this stuff going on, right? Lack of services, lack of some best practices need to be improved, but we don't want to see it being privatized. It's a space that literally veterans need to go to, right?
By the way, talk about some of the direct action events you've been in and what that's like, because you're making contact with other people yes. who are outside the campaign. Mm-hmm. How does that feel?
Powerful. It feels very powerful. It feels engaging, and we have a sense of really building a community and hopefully long-term sustained relationships that will speak to these ills that are facing us today.
Now, the other thing that's been going on, and this is sometimes within this campaign and sometimes in some of the groups it's alive. We see people who are struggling for these different agendas, like a higher minimum wage, voting rights, and these are ordinary people who suddenly become leaders. Why is that so important?
The Center for Policy Studies put out an audit, right? They're working alongside of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And the audit is 50 years after the assassination of Dr. King, right? But what we're doing that is so, I would believe, important is we are accumulating this study with faces, facts, and figures. So the stories of just ordinary people that you rarely hear of are being told and being proved around these conditions with facts and with figures around this country.
So we should mention that people who want to find out more about the events, you've got some social media where they can get that in detail? Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Well, people can go to, of course, poorpeoplescampaign.org. that will jump you into our social media, our national website. You could go to hashtag Poor People's Campaign or a Facebook page that is Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign.
All right, well, thank you very much for being with us.
Welcome.
From the Poor People's Campaign, Massachusetts,
Thank you.
Savina Martin.